One of the greatest misunderstandings about an empath is believing that relationships end because of one big mistake. Most people imagine there is always a dramatic argument, a shocking betrayal, or a single moment when everything falls apart. But that is rarely how it happens for an empath. The relationship doesn't truly begin to break when the final lie is discovered. It begins to break the very first time honesty is replaced with deception. Long before the relationship ends on the outside, trust quietly begins to disappear on the inside. An empath doesn't build relationships on appearances. They don't measure love by expensive gifts, impressive words, or public displays of affection. They measure relationships through emotional safety. They want to know that when someone speaks, those words come from a place of sincerity. They want consistency between actions and promises. They believe that trust is the foundation that allows two people to be completely themselves without fear of manipulation or hidden intentions. That's why even a small lie carries a much greater weight for an empath than most people realize. Many people convince themselves that certain lies don't matter. They call them harmless. They believe hiding the truth will prevent conflict or protect someone's feelings. But an empath rarely focuses on the size of the lie itself. Instead, they focus on what the lie represents. If someone is willing to be dishonest about something small, what happens when life presents something much bigger? That single question begins echoing in the empath's mind. Imagine building a beautiful house on a foundation with tiny cracks. At first, everything appears stable. The walls stand straight. The roof looks secure. Visitors see nothing wrong. But beneath the surface, those cracks slowly spread. Every storm places more pressure on the structure until one day the damage becomes impossible to ignore. Trust works exactly the same way. Every lie creates another crack beneath the relationship. It may not be visible immediately, but its effect is always growing. The difficult part is that empaths often continue loving someone while simultaneously losing trust in them. That creates an emotional conflict that many people never understand. They still care deeply. They still hope things will improve. They still want to believe the best in the person they love. Yet, every dishonest moment makes that hope slightly weaker than before. This is why people are often shocked when an empath finally decides to leave. They say things like, "Everything seemed fine yesterday. We weren't even arguing. I didn't think it was that serious." What they fail to understand is that the relationship had been quietly changing for weeks, months, or even years. The empath wasn't reacting to one conversation. They were responding to hundreds of emotional moments that slowly accumulated until trust no longer felt possible. An empath pays attention to emotional consistency. They notice when promises repeatedly remain unfulfilled. They remember conversations that others have forgotten. They recognize patterns instead of isolated events. While someone else may judge each lie individually, an empath begins connecting them into one larger picture. Suddenly, it isn't about one excuse or one hidden truth anymore. It's about realizing that honesty is no longer the standard within the relationship. Another reason lies hurt an empath so deeply is because they naturally assume honesty in themselves. They often communicate openly about their own fears, struggles, dreams, and emotions. Being emotionally transparent feels normal to them. So when someone repeatedly hides the truth, it creates a painful imbalance. The empath begins wondering, if I'm giving you my authentic self, why am I receiving a performance instead of your truth? That question slowly changes everything. Over time, the empath starts becoming quieter. Not because they've stopped caring, but because they're protecting the parts of themselves that continue getting wounded. They share fewer personal thoughts. They ask fewer questions. They stop expecting openness because experience has taught them disappointment. To the outside world, it may appear that they've become distant overnight. In reality, they've simply reached the point where emotional investment no longer feels safe. What's even more remarkable is that empaths usually don't lose trust because someone made a mistake. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone says something they regret. Everyone has moments of weakness. Empaths understand that better than most people. They are often incredibly forgiving toward genuine human imperfections. What becomes impossible to accept is intentional dishonesty, followed by repeated choices to protect the lie instead of protecting the relationship. Honesty after failure creates healing. Pride after deception creates separation. Many people believe forgiveness instantly restores trust. It doesn't. Forgiveness may release resentment, but trust must be rebuilt through consistent behavior over time. An empath knows the difference. They may forgive someone completely and still decide that allowing them back into their emotional world would only invite more pain. That decision isn't driven by revenge. It's driven by wisdom gained through repeated disappointment. This is why emotional trust is so fragile. It isn't destroyed in one explosive moment. It fades little by little until conversations lose their depth, laughter loses its warmth, and the emotional connection that once felt effortless becomes something neither person can fully recognize anymore. Every lie silently removes another piece of the security that made the relationship feel alive, leaving the empath standing in a place where hope and doubt exist side by side until the weight of deception becomes heavier than the desire to keep believing. Have you ever looked at someone and felt that something wasn't right, even though every word they spoke sounded perfect? Most people ignore that feeling. They brush it aside because they want to believe what they're hearing. But an empath is different. An empath doesn't simply listen to conversations, they experience them. They notice the tiny pause before someone answers a question. They recognize the smile that never reaches the eyes. They hear the confidence in someone's voice suddenly disappear when a certain topic comes up. These details may seem insignificant to everyone else, but to an empath, they form a picture that words alone can never paint. This is one of the greatest misconceptions about empathic people. Many assume that because they are compassionate, they are naive. Because they forgive, they must be easy to fool. Because they give people the benefit of the doubt, they must believe everything they're told. But the truth is almost the opposite. Empaths often recognize deception much earlier than anyone realizes. They simply choose not to react immediately. Think about that for a moment. While someone is carefully constructing a lie, believing they've covered every detail, the empath is quietly observing everything that doesn't fit. They're noticing the shift in breathing, the unusual eye movement, the sudden change in emotional energy, and the inconsistency between yesterday's story and today's explanation. They aren't acting like detectives because they're suspicious by nature. They're paying attention because emotional awareness is part of who they are. They naturally absorb information that other people overlook without even trying. What's fascinating is that an empath rarely exposes someone the instant they discover dishonesty. That surprises many people. If they already know the truth, why stay silent? The answer is simple. Empaths believe in giving people an opportunity to choose honesty on their own. They hope the person will correct themselves. They hope integrity will win over fear. They don't want to embarrass anyone or create unnecessary conflict. Instead, they quietly observe what happens next, and that's where many people make the biggest mistake of their lives. Instead of telling the truth when given another chance, they build another lie to protect the first one, then another, then another. What they don't realize is that every new lie isn't creating confusion for the empath, it's creating clarity. Each contradiction confirms what the empath already suspected. The story becomes impossible to believe because every attempt to hide the truth reveals even more than the original deception. An empath has an incredible ability to notice emotional patterns. They remember how someone acted when they were genuinely happy. They remember how they sounded when they were honest. They notice when someone's energy changes without explanation. They may not always understand the exact reason immediately, but they know something has shifted. That inner awareness isn't magic. It comes from years of paying attention to human behavior, often because they've spent their lives trying to understand and help other people. Many empaths grow up becoming experts at reading emotions because they had to. They learned to recognize tension before arguments started. They learned to sense sadness before tears appeared. They learned to detect anger hidden behind forced smiles. Over time, this emotional awareness becomes second nature. They stop analyzing consciously because their intuition begins connecting patterns automatically. Imagine trying to fool someone who notices not only what you say, but also what you avoid saying. Someone who hears confidence disappear from your voice for a fraction of a second. Someone who remembers conversations from months ago and quietly compares them with today's version of events. That's the challenge of lying to an empath. The deception isn't measured only by facts. It's measured by emotional consistency. People often think intelligence is what exposes lies. Intelligence certainly helps, but empathy adds another dimension entirely. Logic notices contradictions in information. Empathy notices contradictions in emotion. When those two work together, deception becomes incredibly difficult to maintain. This doesn't mean every empath immediately knows every truth. They're still human. They can be hurt, manipulated, and disappointed. But what makes them unique is that they continue collecting emotional evidence long after everyone else has accepted the surface story. While others move on, the empath keeps noticing the small details that never quite fit together. Ironically, the biggest reason people underestimate an empath is because of the empath's silence. Silence is often mistaken for ignorance. People think, if they knew, they would have confronted me. But an empath understands something most people don't. Time reveals character better than confrontation ever could. Instead of forcing someone to confess, they simply watch. Every decision that person makes either rebuilds trust or destroys it completely. That patience is incredibly powerful because it removes the need for arguments. The empath doesn't need to prove someone is lying. Eventually, the truth proves itself. Lies demand constant maintenance, while honesty remains consistent. An empath knows that if someone is pretending to be something they're not, maintaining that performance forever is impossible. Sooner or later, the mask slips, the emotions become impossible to fake, and reality begins to speak louder than words. This is why lying to an empath is such a dangerous gamble. You're not just trying to fool someone's mind, you're trying to fool someone who naturally pays attention to emotions, patterns, consistency, behavior, and the invisible signals that most people never even realize they're sending. Every conversation becomes another piece of a puzzle, and with every interaction, the image grows clearer until the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Have you ever wondered why an empath sometimes asks a question when they already seem to know the answer? At first, it doesn't make sense. If they have already sensed that something is wrong, why ask at all? Why not simply confront the person or walk away? The answer reveals one of the deepest qualities of an empath. They are rarely asking for information. They are giving someone an opportunity to choose honesty. The question is not a trap, it is an invitation. This is something many people completely misunderstand. When an empath calmly asks, "Is there something you're not telling me?" they are often not searching for facts. Their intuition has already noticed changes in behavior, emotional distance, unusual reactions, or inconsistencies that don't fit together. The real question is whether the other person values the relationship enough to tell the truth voluntarily. That single moment becomes incredibly important. Most people believe they are being judged by how convincing their explanation sounds. But an empath is paying attention to something entirely different. They are observing whether your words match your emotional energy. They notice hesitation before you answer. They notice whether your expression changes when certain details come up. They notice if your confidence suddenly disappears or if your explanation feels rehearsed instead of genuine. An empath has learned that truth carries a different emotional weight than deception. Honest people may struggle to explain painful situations, but their emotions remain authentic. Someone who is lying often spends more energy protecting the story than expressing genuine emotion. That subtle difference is something an empath naturally senses. Think about how many conversations happen every day where people only hear words. Now imagine being someone who notices everything surrounding those words. The silence before an answer, the tension in someone's shoulders, the forced laugh that arrives a second too late, the sudden attempt to change the subject. These details may appear insignificant individually, but together they create a pattern that becomes difficult to ignore. That's why an empath often seems unusually calm during conversations involving dishonesty. The person telling the lie may become nervous, trying harder and harder to sound believable. Meanwhile, the empath grows quieter. They aren't becoming confused, they're becoming certain. One of the greatest strengths of an empath is patience. They understand that people eventually reveal who they are without being forced. They don't always need evidence immediately because they know consistency exposes truth over time. Instead of interrupting every contradiction, they allow the conversation to continue. They observe, they remember. They compare today's version of events with yesterday's. Eventually, the inconsistencies become impossible to hide. Ironically, many people mistake this patience for ignorance. They leave the conversation believing, "They believed me. They didn't question anything. I got away with it." What they fail to realize is that the empath wasn't trying to win the conversation. They were trying to understand the person standing in front of them. Every answer became another piece of information, not just about the situation, but about the person's character. Because to an empath, honesty isn't simply about facts. Honesty reflects integrity. When someone chooses to lie even after being given the opportunity to tell the truth, the empath learns something much more important than the hidden information itself. They learn how that person responds when integrity is tested. That lesson often carries far greater consequences than the original mistake ever could. Here's something that surprises many people. Empaths are usually more forgiving of painful truths than comfortable lies. You can admit failure. You can admit fear. You can admit making the wrong decision. Those admissions may hurt temporarily, but they create room for healing because they are rooted in honesty. Deception closes that door. Every additional lie forces the empath to question not only the current situation, but every previous conversation as well. Suddenly, memories begin connecting in ways they never did before. Statements that once seemed harmless now feel suspicious. Excuses that were once accepted begin sounding different. The empath starts seeing patterns that weren't obvious before because dishonesty has changed the entire context of the relationship. This is why trust often disappears much faster after a lie than many people expect. The issue is no longer one event. It's uncertainty about everything else. An empath begins wondering, if this wasn't true, what else wasn't true? That question echoes through every memory they shared together. Many people think empaths rely only on intuition, but that's only part of the story. Their intuition simply alerts them that something deserves attention. After that, observation takes over. They quietly gather information through actions, consistency, emotional behavior, and repeated experiences. Their conclusions are rarely based on one feeling alone. They come from countless small moments that slowly connect into one clear picture. That's why arguing with an empath after they've recognized dishonesty usually accomplishes very little. The conversation isn't competing against one accusation. It's competing against months or even years of observation stored in their memory. Every contradiction has already been compared with previous experiences. Every emotional shift has already been noticed. Every inconsistency has already been quietly filed away. Perhaps the most remarkable part of all is that an empath rarely feels satisfaction when they discover they were right. Contrary to what many assume, they don't celebrate exposing deception. In fact, they often wish they had been wrong. They would rather discover that their concerns were unnecessary than learn that someone they trusted chose dishonesty. Because every lie forces an empath to let go of the version of the relationship they believed was real. It replaces certainty with disappointment and hope with caution. When they ask the question, they aren't hoping to catch someone in a lie. They're hoping to be given a reason to keep believing, a reason to protect the connection they've invested in, and a reason to trust that honesty still matters more than the comfort of hiding the truth. One of the saddest transformations an empath can experience is not becoming angry. It is becoming emotionally distant. Most people expect pain to create loud arguments, dramatic confrontations, or explosive reactions. But when an empath has been lied to over and over again, something much quieter begins to happen. The warmth that once made them feel safe slowly fades. The excitement they once brought into every conversation becomes restrained. Their willingness to understand every excuse begins to disappear. It is not because they have stopped caring overnight. It is because repeated deception slowly teaches them that compassion without honesty becomes self-destruction. An empath naturally believes in seeing the good in people. They often notice potential where others only see flaws. When someone makes a mistake, an empath usually searches for the reason behind the behavior before rushing to judgment. They ask themselves whether the person is hurting, afraid, overwhelmed, or struggling with something invisible. This incredible compassion is one of their greatest strengths, but it can also become the very reason they stay in unhealthy relationships longer than they should. Every time someone lies, the empath tells themselves a story. Maybe they're scared. Maybe they didn't know how to tell me. Maybe this is just a temporary mistake. Those thoughts come from kindness, not weakness. They genuinely want to believe that people can choose honesty if given enough understanding. They offer second chances because they know perfection doesn't exist. They understand that every human being has moments of fear and failure. But something changes when those second chances become a pattern. Eventually, the empath realizes they are no longer forgiving isolated mistakes. They are forgiving repeated choices. There is an enormous difference between someone who regrets hurting you and someone who simply expects you to forgive them every time. One reflects growth, the other reflects entitlement. This realization is often the beginning of emotional distance. The change doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual. The empath laughs a little less. They stop sharing every detail about their day. They no longer rush to answer every message. The deep conversations become shorter. The emotional energy they once gave so freely begins to retreat. Most people never notice this process while it's happening because nothing dramatic occurs. There are no loud announcements saying, "I'm withdrawing from this relationship." Instead, every disappointment quietly removes another piece of emotional investment. Ironically, the person who keeps lying often becomes comfortable during this stage. They mistake silence for acceptance. They think everything seems normal again. But what they don't understand is that the empath has stopped fighting because they have started protecting themselves. There comes a point where explaining the same pain repeatedly becomes exhausting. If someone truly wanted to understand, they would have listened the first few times. Continuing to explain only drains emotional energy that the empath no longer wants to waste. One of the most misunderstood things about empaths is that they eventually learn the difference between helping someone and sacrificing themselves for someone. Early in life, they often confuse the two. They believe enough patience can heal dishonesty. They believe enough love can inspire change. They believe enough understanding can transform someone's character. Experience teaches them otherwise. Character only changes when the individual chooses change for themselves. No amount of compassion can replace personal responsibility. This lesson is painful because empaths genuinely want to believe people can become better. Watching someone repeatedly choose deception despite receiving kindness creates a heartbreak that is difficult to describe. It isn't just disappointment in another person. It's disappointment in the future they imagine together. As emotional distance grows, the empath also begins trusting themselves more. Instead of questioning every instinct, they start respecting it. Instead of ignoring uncomfortable feelings, they listen to them. Instead of making endless excuses for someone's behavior, they begin accepting reality exactly as it is. This shift changes everything. The empath no longer focuses on who the person could become. They focus on who the person consistently chooses to be. That single change in perspective creates incredible emotional freedom. Another surprising transformation begins to happen. The empath stops trying to convince people to treat them well. Think about how much energy many people spend asking for honesty, asking for respect, asking for effort, asking for consistency. An empath eventually realizes that genuine character doesn't need constant reminders. Someone who values the relationship will naturally protect it. When that realization settles in, something powerful happens. The empath becomes calmer, not because the pain disappears, but because expectations become clearer. They stop chasing explanations from people who continue creating confusion. They stop begging for honesty from people who repeatedly choose dishonesty. They stop investing enormous emotional energy into relationships where trust has become one-sided. The outside world. This transformation often looks cold. Friends might say, "You've changed. You aren't as emotional as you used to be. You don't care anymore." But that's rarely the truth. The empath still cares deeply. They simply become much more careful about where they place that care. Their compassion becomes protected instead of unlimited. Their kindness becomes intentional instead of automatic. Their emotional availability becomes something earned instead of freely given to everyone. Repeated deception doesn't destroy an empath's ability to love. It teaches them the importance of loving wisely. This emotional distance is not built from hatred. It is built from lessons. Every broken promise teaches caution. Every hidden truth teaches discernment. Every manipulation teaches stronger boundaries. Eventually, the empath realizes that preserving their own peace is not selfish but necessary, and they begin choosing relationships where honesty is freely given instead of constantly requested, where trust grows naturally instead of being repaired after every deception, and where compassion is met with integrity rather than repeatedly tested through lies and disappointment. One of the biggest mistakes people make is believing that an empath will always come back because they have always forgiven in the past. They remember the countless second chances, the endless patience, and the incredible compassion they received, so they convince themselves that this time will be no different. They assume that if enough time passes, the empath will eventually forget the lies and overlook the broken promises and reopen the door exactly as before. What they fail to understand is that when an empath finally decides to walk away, the decision is almost never impulsive. It is the result of a long emotional journey that has already taken place long before anyone else notices. An empath rarely leaves after the first disappointment. They stay. They communicate. They try to understand. They give opportunities for honesty. They hope things will improve. They believe people can grow. That is why their departure surprises so many people. Others only see the final decision. They never witness the months or years of silent disappointment that slowly led to it. Every conversation where the empath chose patience instead of anger. Every moment they ignored their own intuition because they wanted to believe the best in someone. Every night they questioned themselves instead of questioning the person who kept hurting them. By the time an empath leaves, they have often exhausted every emotional possibility they could imagine. This is what makes their goodbye so different. It isn't driven by temporary emotion, it's driven by acceptance. Acceptance that trust can no longer survive where honesty no longer exists. Acceptance that love cannot repair what deception continues to destroy. Acceptance that protecting their own peace has become more important than preserving a relationship built on uncertainty. Many people expect an empath to argue until the very end, but something unusual happens instead. The closer they come to leaving, the quieter they become. The arguments become fewer. The emotional reactions become smaller. The desperate attempts to fix everything begin disappearing. This silence often creates false confidence in the other person. They assume everything has improved because conflict has disappeared. They don't realize the empath has simply stopped investing energy into conversations that no longer create change. There comes a moment when the empath realizes they cannot carry the entire relationship alone. Love requires two people. Trust requires two people. Honesty requires two people. No amount of kindness can replace effort from someone who continues choosing dishonesty. That realization changes everything. The empath no longer feels responsible for saving what another person refuses to protect. And when they finally walk away, something remarkable begins happening inside them. They stop chasing explanations. They stop wondering whether they were enough. They stop blaming themselves for someone else's decisions. Instead, they begin rebuilding the relationship they neglected the most, the one with themselves. For many empaths, leaving is not simply the end of one relationship. It becomes the beginning of an entirely new identity. They start trusting their intuition instead of questioning it. They create stronger boundaries instead of unlimited access. They learn that saying no is not cruelty. They discover that protecting their emotional health is not selfish. Every painful experience becomes a lesson rather than a lifelong wound. This transformation often surprises everyone around them. The same empath who once tolerated endless excuses now calmly walks away from disrespect. The person who constantly tried to rescue everyone now understands that not everyone wants to be saved. The individual who feared disappointing others now refuses to disappoint themselves. People often describe this change by saying the empath has become cold. But that's not what actually happened. They didn't lose compassion. They learned discernment. There is an enormous difference. Compassion loves people. Discernment decides who deserves continued access to that love. Healthy boundaries are not emotional walls. They are emotional filters. They allow trustworthy people to come closer while protecting the empath from repeated harm. Ironically, this stronger version of the empath often becomes more peaceful than ever before. Without constant deception draining their energy, they begin rediscovering parts of themselves they forgot existed. Their confidence slowly returns. Their creativity grows. Their laughter becomes genuine again. Their relationships become healthier because they no longer accept emotional inconsistency as normal. They realize they never needed endless apologies. They needed consistent honesty. One of the hardest moments for the person left behind comes much later. It happens when they finally realize the empath isn't coming back in the way they expected. Perhaps they receive a polite response. Perhaps they receive forgiveness. Perhaps they even have another conversation. But something is undeniably different. The innocence is gone. The unquestioning trust has disappeared. The emotional dependence no longer exists. The empath may still wish them well. They may still hope they become a better person. But the version of themselves that ignored repeated lies no longer exists. That's why people often say they lost an empath forever. Not because the empath became hateful, but because the experience transformed them. Every lie became a lesson, every betrayal became wisdom, every disappointment strengthened their boundaries. The person standing before them is still compassionate, still caring, and still capable of deep love, but that love is now guided by self-respect instead of endless sacrifice. They no longer confuse forgiveness with unlimited access. They no longer mistake potential for character, and they no longer believe that enduring repeated deception is the price of keeping someone in their life, because they have finally learned that the greatest act of empathy is not endlessly understanding the people who continue to hurt them, but understanding their own worth enough to walk away from anyone who repeatedly chooses lies. As we come to the end of this message, remember one truth that stands above everything else: an empath is not defined by how deeply they love, but by how deeply they value truth. They may forgive mistakes, overlook imperfections, and give more chances than most people ever would, but honesty is the one foundation they cannot live without. The moment deception becomes a habit, the relationship begins losing the very thing that made it meaningful. If you have an empath in your life, never mistake their patience for blindness. Never mistake their silence for weakness. Never mistake their kindness for permission to take advantage of them. They notice far more than they say, they understand far more than they reveal, and they often carry the weight of disappointment long before anyone realizes something is wrong. Every lie asks them to question not only your words, but also the trust they invested in you, and every repeated deception slowly teaches them to protect a heart that was once completely open. The greatest lesson from today's speech is not that empaths are impossible to deceive. They are human, and like everyone else, they can be hurt. The real lesson is that once they discover the truth, they rarely look at the relationship through the same eyes again. Their compassion remains, but it becomes wiser. Their love remains, but it becomes more selective. Their kindness remains, but it is no longer offered without boundaries. Truth has an incredible power. It may create uncomfortable conversations, but it also creates lasting trust. Lies may seem easier in the moment, but they demand constant maintenance until they eventually collapse under their own weight. Honesty, even when it is difficult, allows relationships to grow stronger because it replaces fear with security and uncertainty with confidence. If there is one message to take with you today, let it be this: never lie to someone whose greatest strength is understanding people. Respect their trust before asking for their loyalty. Protect their heart before expecting their forgiveness. Choose honesty when it feels difficult, because truth may test a relationship for a moment, but deception can destroy it for a lifetime. If this message spoke to you, take a moment to reflect on the relationships that matter most in your life. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and remember that the strongest relationships are never built on perfect people. They are built on imperfect people who choose honesty, integrity, and trust every single day.